Hi there, it's Matt here and welcome back to the podcast. In today's episode, we're going to dive deep into one of the most perhaps intriguing developments in terms of products within sleep science, and that is weighted blankets or gravity blankets. If you've been on social media or browsed any wellness websites in the last few years, you've probably heard them mentioned. But what exactly are weighted blankets? And more importantly, what does the science say regarding their effectiveness for sleep? So let's get started with the basics. Weighted blankets are essentially heavy duvet covers, and they usually range from anywhere between about 10 to 15 pounds. I've seen them all the way up to 40 pounds, and they're typically filled with materials like glass beads or plastic pellets to produce that heaviness or that weighted feeling. Now, weighted blankets aren't new to the hallways of what we would call therapy, because it turns out that occupational therapists have used weighted tools of some kind, including blankets, for decades now to help children with sensory processing disorders and also things like autism. What's new here in the mainstream popularity is the additional therapeutic suggestion that they help improve sleep. Perhaps they help it by way of lots of different mechanisms that we'll speak about, and those weighted blankets have really been fueled by word-of-mouth success stories and expanded marketing campaigns. Let's go into a little bit of a historical lesson when it comes to weighted blankets, because as I said, it's not new. It's not even new for sleep. The historical roots, if you really want to know them, they date back to the 1960s when Dr. Temple Grandin, who was an occupational therapist, noticed that cattle in squeeze chutes became calmer under pressure, and not under pressure of, like we would think of pressure to work or a deadline. I'm talking here under sort of the physicality of pressure, sort of hugging their bodies. And this inspired what she ended up producing was a hugging machine for autistic individuals, which later influenced various pressure-based therapeutic tools, including weighted blankets. In other words, there's something about the somatic, the sensory sensation of being held with just modest pressure, obviously nothing painful, but a securing level of pressure, I think I would describe it, that allows individuals to start to feel more calm and more settled. And this brings us on to then subsequent work looking at deep pressure stimulation. And the concept behind weighted blankets revolves around this idea of deep pressure sensation, or what we call deep pressure stimulation. And it's the same principle that makes, one of those really warm, firm sort of hugs feel very comforting and soothing. And this pressure appears to reduce activity of what we call the fight or flight branch of the nervous system, or it's poorly named, it's called the sympathetic nervous system. It's not sympathetic, it's very agitating. And it helps then shift us over to what we call the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the quiescent branch of our nervous system. And when we have this type of deep pressure stimulation, that shifts us away from the fight or flight branch into this quiescent parasympathetic branch of the nervous system. In response, the body releases more of a chemical called serotonin. And one of the consequences of that serotonin release is that it allows us to both feel a little bit more calm. It can have feelings that are positive in the mood and emotion relation. But one of the other things that an increased release of serotonin does is it allows us to produce more of another hormone that is derived in the same pathway from serotonin called melatonin. And that is a key hormone that we've spoken about for the regulation of sleep. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself here in terms of the mechanism. Let me come back to deep pressure stimulation, because there's some really great studies now, including fascinating brain imaging studies using tools called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI for short. And what they found is that when an individual inside one of these MRI scanners is then receiving this nice deep pressure stimulation, it activates areas like the insular cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, which are both areas that are important in helping us control and regulate our emotions and also help regulate stress. So unlike sedative drugs or sedative pharmacology or chemical aids, weighted blankets have been argued to leverage the body's own innate relaxation pathways. And so the idea here is not that weighted blankets have a direct mechanism that tries to force you to sleep. They don't work on the sleep mechanisms. Instead, they send signals of safety that naturally calm your body down, and it slows the respiration. And you need to calm the body down and slow down respiration for you to then instigate the mechanisms that generate sleep. In other words, weighted blankets are trying to encourage you down the paths that will ultimately lead to the next sort of junction, right hand or left hand turn, whichever you prefer, which is down to the sleep pathway. But you've got to get down that relaxation, that quiescent path of the nervous system before you can get into sleep. Otherwise, you can be as tired can be, but you won't fall asleep if you're still in that fight or flight branch of the nervous system. And that is what we call the tired but wired phenomenon. But again, I'm drifting here. Now, in terms of recommendations, coming back to weighted blankets, how do you calculate what's best for you? Well, it's usually the guesstimate calculation is about 10% of your body weight, give or take a pound or two. And it's that level of weightedness, as it were, that is required to help trigger the deep pressure effect. Now, you don't want to go too far. More and more isn't better, because at some point it will be too restrictive and you'll actually start to feel a little bit anxious because it's pressing down on the chest too much. But you get the idea here. So unlike stacking multiple regular blankets, which I can already see some people thinking about doing, but that's probably me actually, idiot that I am, weighted blankets are designed for even weight distribution through the specialized stitching or gridding compartments. And those hold the beads in place so that you get this even sort of surface area spreading out of that weight. And it ensures consistent pressure across the body throughout the night. And it avoids that clumping that may disrupt, in fact, your rest and even cause you problems with sleep. So always look for blankets, if you're going to get them, that have that partitioning in them. A long-standing partner of today's podcast is Element, spelled LMNT. Element is a sugar-free electrolyte mix. And for me, it was the sugar-free part of that made me start using it quite some time ago. Beyond having the electrolytes in the right balance, the other reason I'm a fan of Element is that it's scientific. And if you look at the people who created the company, you'll find some pretty heavy-hitting physiology, biochemistry, and pharmacology knowledge that is baked into the product. And again, all of that comes without any sugar. I am a devotee of their product. I really do use them. I know people will say that on these ad reads. I use it every single day for my workout. I put it in my protein shakes afterwards. I do use it. Also, by the way, Element has just recently brought back the chocolate medley range, which you can have essentially your electrolytes hot. And in the trio of flavors, there is chocolate mint, chocolate chai, and also my favorite, chocolate raspberry. And by the way, I happily badgered them to agree to give you fine folks a free sample pack with any purchase of Element if you just use the link lmnt.com/Matt Walker. That's lmnt.com/Matt Walker. So, as potential non-pharmacological approaches to better sleep, of course, weighted blankets are particularly appealing. Why? Well, it's estimated that, at least here in America, 9 million individuals will use some kind of a prescription sleep aid regularly. And that, I think, underscores the demand for what we now must start to explore, which are alternatives to those medications to avoid long-term medication side effect and also dependency issues. And that's why the marketing value of weighted blankets has surged. It's believed to now be close to $1 billion industry, if you can believe it. And that's because of consumer awareness, social media, testimonies, and, well, what about the scientific data? That's what we're here to discuss. Let's get to it. It really all started, I think, with perhaps not necessarily the first study, but the first really detailed, what I would think of as high quality study back in 2020. And it was a clinical trial with weighted blankets by Ekholm and colleagues. And the study enrolled 120 individuals with both insomnia and psychiatric disorders. So they used a weighted blanket here of 8 kilograms. And if I do my sort of mental gymnastic, that's probably around 17 pounds, 17 and a half pounds or something like that. So what did they find? Well, what they found was that the participants who had insomnia, 42% of those participants achieved complete remission from insomnia. And that was compared to 16% in a control group, essentially the placebo group. Furthermore, on average, the participants not only gained clinical resolution to their insomnia, at least 42% of them, which still, by the way, means that almost 60% of them did not achieve complete remission in terms of their insomnia. So please don't think that this study was by any means suggesting that there is a one-size-fits-all Shangri-La of insomnia recovery with a weighted blanket. You're getting about a 42% responder rate here. What was also interesting is that on average, participants slept about 26 minutes longer, and about 72% of them reported feeling less fatigued during the day. In other words, they felt more restored and refreshed by their sleep. And both of those are, those are substantial things. Things like feeling as though you are sleeping longer by at least 25 minutes and feeling as though you're more alert and just wakeful during the day. Those are non-trivial things for people with insomnia. They also found that the psychiatric symptoms associated with the insomnia benefited too. Anxiety and depression scores dropped by 26 and 20 points respectively. And relative to the scale, which I won't bore you with, those were significant and non-trivial amounts as well. So in other words, by way of better sleep, no wonder, based on how we understand the relationship between sleep and mood disorders, when sleep is better, there are broader health consequences, and specifically mental health consequences. So that was an impressive study of 2020, and that was followed quickly on the heels of it by a 2021 study monitoring 45 now healthy adults. And they used gold standard sleep laboratory recordings or polysomnography to capture every brainwave and body movement across the consecutive nights. And what they found was that there was about a 12 to 19% boost in deep sleep in these healthy individuals. And the amount of movement, a sort of thrashing around and that sort of more restless sleep, that dropped by about 31%. So it offered suggestions of perhaps a clear sign of calmer sleep at least, and maybe some boosts in the amount of deep sleep. They also found, and it wasn't a vast size in terms of an experimental effect, but they did find that those individuals relative to the control group who used the weighted blanket, they had a drop in morning cortisol. Now, morning cortisol is important. You actually need a rise in morning cortisol. But for some of these individuals, that peak, that rise was a little bit too high, and it showed a modest reduction, perhaps at least suggesting that when we wake up, there is a slightly lowered stress response in those individuals. A partner and sponsor of today's podcast is Shopify. Let me share the link right away. Shopify.com/Matt Walker. As someone who spends his days researching sleep, the idea of selling merch felt, well, rather daunting. But I kept getting asked if I had t-shirts or gear. So I finally said, okay, Matt, get your act together and give it a try. And we have them coming. But the big question was, how on earth was someone like me, a scientist, going to get these items into your hands? Everyone said the same thing, use Shopify. It turns out, even me, an analog man in a digital world, was able to do it without any learning curve. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US. From household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. With hundreds of ready-to-use templates, you can build a really impressive online store that matches your brand style. Oh, and if you need artificial intelligence-powered help writing product descriptions or touching up images, Shopify's got that too. All of which is to say that if you're ready to sell, just try Shopify. So if you are interested, turn your business idea into reality with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/Matt Walker. Once more, that's shopify.com/Matt Walker. So those were all studies in adults, but I would be remiss to tell you about the science of weighted blankets without speaking about children. And here I want to focus on the pediatric population of children with ADHD. What we know is that, and I've done a whole episode on this if you want to go and explore it, but individuals with ADHD, sleep issues are highly prevalent. In fact, usually somewhere between 1 out of every 4 or even 1 out of every 2 children who are diagnosed with ADHD have marked sleep problems. They have resistance to bedtime. They have frequent awakenings. They find it very difficult to fall asleep. And unfortunately, what we know is that when sleep problems are most pronounced, symptoms of ADHD are increased significantly. And when symptoms of ADHD during the day are increased significantly, sleep is even worse at night, creating this vicious cycle that undermines the daily functioning and, of course, the academic performance of ADHD on these children. And, of course, nighttime issues are not just about the child themselves. They also burden the families significantly. Now, there are pharmacological sleep interventions that exist. Things like melatonin has been used and some other pharmacological agents. But, pharmacology is not without carrying side effects, and some parents don't always want to resolve the underlying issues linked to ADHD and the sleep problems with some kind of pharmacology. And this is where weighted blankets are commonly recommended. They're actually very commonly recommended in certain countries. I think perhaps places like Sweden, for example, they will have a process of common recommendation of weighted blankets because of the robust research in terms of benefits for sleep for kids with ADHD. And I would say that the preliminary studies are certainly encouraging. There was now probably a series of key investigations back in probably the mid-2020s. And although there was some mixed data there were generally positive signs that children with ADHD who were using weighted blankets typically fell asleep faster, and they felt calmer and were less restless at night. In fact, there was probably a great, more recent study, probably back in 2022. It was actually done in Sweden, as my memory recollects now. And it was a randomized control trial involving 100 children with ADHD who had confirmed sleep problems. And they compared weighted blankets against non-weighted control blankets in what we call a crossover design. So all of the children will go through both arms of the study, the weighted blanket arm of the study and the non-weighted blanket arm of the study. So everyone acts as their own control. It's a very powerful experimental design. And what they demonstrated here in this study, sure enough, was that those individuals, when they were using the weighted blanket, they reported that their own subjective quality of sleep was better. And in fact, the objective measures of sleep using these special wristwatches showed modest, at least, differences in sleep improvement. And I think, again, it underlies this potential benefit in specific cohorts within the pediatric population, at least, for weighted blanket use in terms of sleep disturbance and sleep issues. And then probably the most recent study that I think, just came out maybe a handful of months ago, is right at the end of 2024. And they were looking once again at older adults, but now older adults with really quite severe insomnia. And they studied what was really quite a large group for at least that type of a study. It was over 100 adults. And they were using a 5.5 kilogram weighted blanket. So what's that? That's probably around about 11.5, 12 pounds. The way that they were measuring sleep in these individuals was using a very well-validated sleep questionnaire. It's called the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, or the PSQI. And you can just go online, you can search for PSQI sleep, and you can fill it out. It's a really great, interesting sleep questionnaire that gives you, how could I describe it? It's almost like a great health sleep snapshot across the prior month. What they found was that almost all of the participants who used the weighted blanket versus the control group who were using a lighter weight blanket, almost all of them showed at least some improvement in this very well validated sleep questionnaire, the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, or the PSQI. And in fact, the individuals who used the weighted blankets reduced their Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index score. Now, by the way, reductions mean better scores in terms of sleep. So if you have a very high PSQI score, it's usually not good. It means that your sleep quantity and quality isn't great. But they reduced their PSQI score by about 4.1%. And the individuals who, now again, remember, all of these individuals were individuals with insomnia. And what they found was that for those who were using the weighted blanket, about 42% of them at the end of that trial reduced their level of sleep disruption and insomnia ratings such that they would no longer be classified as having clinical insomnia, 42% of them. Now, that was relative to at least the lighter weighted blanket, where only 24% ended up shifting from an insomnia condition to a no clinical insomnia condition. Also, what they found were some daytime benefits. So for those who were using the weighted blanket, there was about a 29% drop in daytime sleepiness. And there was a pronounced decrease in their self-reported level of stress. They also not only rated their stress levels as lower, but it also came with reductions in their levels of anxiety. And they also just felt more refreshed and alert during the day. They felt less fatigued. So I think all of this is at least some tentative evidence that in individuals who struggle with sleep, people with insomnia, and in certain pediatric populations where there are significant sleep disruption, things like ADHD, and also there's some data in autism, there does seem to be growing scientific evidence that weighted blankets can have an objective improvement in sleep and also a subjective sense of improvement in not just sleep, but also in the degree of restoration and refreshment that you feel from that sleep when you wake up during the day. That's not to say that people who aren't in those clinical categories or who aren't in those pediatric categories will benefit from weighted blankets in any way, shape, or form. We just don't have enough data, at least yet. Although I think there is one study there in the 45 healthy adults with no signs who did seem to show a benefit. So who knows? I think the jury is open for the majority of the general population without sleep problems. A partner for today's episode is AG1. I've been using AG1 for quite some time now, And just for the record, I buy it myself to stay away from any of those trappings of free product. AG1 has just released the new formulation, which is AG1 Next Gen. It's still one scoop once a day, but now comes with many upgraded probiotics, plus additional vitamins and minerals. I also explored their 4 human clinical trials to prove out their efficacy, with the data showing a marked boost in healthy gut bacteria. And that's the thing. I appreciate how AG1 keeps adapting to new scientific findings. They have made many formula changes over the years, and each new iteration keeps it at the cutting edge of this space. As I've mentioned, I began my AG1 journey over 4 years ago. Any company that holds their scientific rigor to the flames of clinical trials means a lot to me. So subscribe today to try the next gen of AG1. If you use the following link, you'll also get a free bottle of AGD 3K2, as well as an AG1 welcome kit and 5 of the upgraded AG1 travel packs with your first order. So make sure to check out drinkag1.com/Matt Walker. That's drinkag1.com/Matt Walker. But what that still leaves is, in those cohorts where we do see a benefit of weighted blankets, exactly what is the mechanism? Because for us to entertain causality, we really have to understand the mechanistic underpinnings, because you can't really entertain a causal benefit without us at least having some sense of how that causal benefit is being derived through the mechanism. And I've already spoken a little bit about the mechanism, but I think right now sleep science really suggests that there are probably 5 main scientific mechanisms by which weighted blankets can help. The first is one I discussed before, which is deep pressure stimulation, or DPS. And it's that hugging sensation that increases serotonin. It also increases dopamine too, reducing cortisol, and more specifically, it seems to change the nervous system. But the first is the neurotransmitter benefits, particularly serotonin, which could get then converted into melatonin. The second is something we already discussed too, its impact on the nervous system, shifting you away from the fight or flight branch and over into that quiescent parasympathetic nervous system, that lowered heart rate state, that state of stabilized respiration. Both of those things are required for you to be able to fall asleep. The other is that perhaps through the physicality of the weighted blanket, it reduces the amount of nighttime awakenings because you're not tossing and turning as much. And so even though your body may wish to have a restless movement night, the weighted blanket almost traps your body and fools you into not fully waking up. And therefore you stay asleep for longer, which means that your overall sleep efficiency is increased. And that's what some of the data suggests with weighted blankets as well. I think the other benefit is one not necessarily on the physicality of the body, but on the psychology of the mind. These weighted blankets cause reductions in anxiety, and it lowers perhaps the anxiety as you're getting into bed and you're just starting to fall asleep, and it reduces down that pre-sleep rumination, because when you start to ruminate, you catastrophize, and at that point your mind is racing, the Rolodex of anxiety is going, and it's so hard to fall asleep. I think the final one, that the reason I was sort of saying 4, oh no, maybe 5, the final one is probably that comes to mind is pain relief. That by way of the pressure on the body, it can cause muscle relaxation, and that muscle relaxation can reduce chronic pain. And chronic pain, we know, outside of anxiety, is one of the other principal reasons that people are not being able to sleep. So where does this leave us then? Well, despite the promise, I think these findings come with a few caveats. Sample sizes. Almost all of the studies that I've discussed and that are out there right now are relatively small sample sizes in very specific populations, such as children with specific disorders, people with certain maybe clinical sleep conditions like insomnia. So it requires specialized caution. Many of the studies, not all of them, but many of the studies rely on self-reported sleep. So how do you feel about your sleep? How long were you asleep, rather than objective measures? And that can introduce some biases. So I think the long-term effects of weighted blankets on really good gold standard sleep laboratory recordings are yet to fully manifest. I think also individuals with circulatory concerns or very young children should consult with a healthcare professional before using a weighted blanket, given the potential risks of that extra weight. I would say to truly validate weighted blankets, we're going to need really larger scale studies, probably randomized clinical control trials using objective measures, as I said, like gold standard polysomnography. They're going to have to be studied over longer periods of time, not just maybe even a week or 2 weeks. And then I think it would probably be really interesting to try to see if we can not just say it's only weighted blankets that we should be approaching for people with sleep problems, but a combination, a synergy of treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, plus weighted blankets, plus mindfulness-based stress reduction, plus breathing, you can name it, but I think some kind of a stacked approach would really be beneficial. And that will go from, maybe you heard, as I spoke about in one of the studies, there was about a 42% responder rate that shifted them into a non-clinical insomnia condition. Well, could we get that up to not 42%, but maybe 88% if we combined all of these other beneficial non-pharmacological sleep treatments? So I still think that weighted blankets offer a really fascinating non-pharmacological path towards a potentially better path of sleep for specific individuals in specific circumstances, those struggling with insomnia or stress, mild to moderate anxiety, and in certain pediatric populations. As always, though, it's best to approach any one of these quote-unquote social media therapeutic tools with informed caution, and that's why I'm trying to do this podcast, so I can help perhaps you a little bit with ensuring your selection of really good quality approaches to better sleep, including good products that you purchase. I don't want you to be out of pocket for no good reason. So if you're considering one of these for yourself or for a loved one, keep in mind that there are some recommended weighted blanket guidelines that I mentioned. About 10% of your body weight seems to be about the sweet spot. And just otherwise think about the basics of good sleep hygiene, things like regularity, darkness, getting light in the morning, being mindful of alcohol and caffeine, trying to manage your stress, having a wind down routine. Those things will get you so far along the path of good sleep. It's not to say that you couldn't add weighted blankets atop of that, but just keep in mind that the weighted blanket, it is not the magic bullet for sleep. But it certainly does seem to have some fascinating data that is moving us towards a broader embrace of weighted blankets. We've still got a good amount of research studies to go before we get there, though. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode, and I hope this more detailed exploration of weighted blankets from a scientific perspective rather than a sort of necessarily a social media perspective gives you some valuable insights into their potential benefits. Please be sure to come and provide what other topics or products that you would like me to cover on this show. You can find me on social media. I'm on X or Twitter at Sleep Diplomat. I'm on Instagram, Dr. Matt Walker, DrMattWalker. And I am now on YouTube. I am fully there. I now have the full back catalog of all of my podcasts are now on my YouTube channel. And there's lots of new, fresh content that is not featured on this podcast that will be there on the YouTube channel. And if you want to visit that YouTube channel, you just need to go over to The Sleep Diplomat on YouTube. So all one word, The Sleep Diplomat. Thank you so much for tuning in. Take care. Good night. And I'll see you next time. Bye for now.